The year is 1660 and the founder of the Maratha Empire, Chattrapati Shivaji Maharaj, finds himself trapped, starving and surrounded by enemy forces on all sides, and his enemies are determined to either mount his head on a spike or watch him slowly starve to death. But Shivaji knows that if he falls tonight, his entire kingdom will die with him, and his people will fall into the clutches of the Mughal Empire or the Bijapur Sultanate once again. Survival is possible, but it will come at an impossibly high price. The deaths of many close friends and comrades, and even then, escape is still not guaranteed. But 300 elite warriors are determined to protect their king and kingdom, and they will hold off a much larger enemy force at a narrow mountain gorge. And I'm sure this is starting to sound familiar to a lot of people, because today we will be doing a deep dive into the Indian version of the Battle of Thermopylae. Today we will be discussing the Battle of Pavan Khind and the brave sacrifice of 300 Maratha soldiers in one of the greatest last stands in Indian history. But before we begin, don't forget, if you want to find out more about wars, warriors and weapons from Indian history, then subscribe to my channel, Lethal History. So before we can discuss the last stand at Pavan Khind, we first need to understand how the Maratha Emperor Shivaji found himself besieged and on the run in the first place. Well, less than a year earlier in 1659, Shivaji had irrevocably changed the geopolitical order of the Deccan by defeating the Bijapuri general Afzal Khan at the Battle of Pratapgarh, and encouraged by this victory, the Maratha forces blitzed the region, capturing a massive swathe of Adilshahi territory, including the strategic fortress of Panhala and other parts of the Deccan as well. But the retaliation to this Maratha expansion was swift and more catastrophic than Shivaji could have ever imagined, as the Bijapur Sultanate, under the leadership of Ali Adil Shah II, aligned himself with the immensely powerful Mughal Empire to crush the newly formed Maratha state in a devastating two-front war. Mughal forces under the command of Shaista Khan pressed in from the north, while Bijapur unleashed its most relentless veteran general, the Abyssinian commander Siddi Jauhar, to corner Shivaji from the south. One of these armies alone would have been difficult for Shivaji to defeat, but fighting the combined forces of both Muslim armies was impossible, and Shivaji and his Maratha forces would eventually find themselves cornered and besieged at the fort of Panhala. And the veteran Bijapuri general Siddi Jauhar immediately cut every supply line to the fortress, and he was ready to starve the Marathas into submission. But inside the walls of the Panhala Fort, Shivaji practiced strategic patience, perhaps hoping that the brutal monsoon rains would break the besiegers' resolve. And Maratha commander Netaji Palkar launched frantic external cavalry raids to shatter the siege lines. But every attempt failed, and after 5 months of being besieged, the supply lines within the fort were exhausted, and with no food, water, or reinforcements available, the Maratha commanders all agreed on one final, suicidal gamble to break out of the fortress and perhaps live to fight another day. And with these thoughts in mind, the first part of the escape plan was put into action, a midnight breakout that would lead the Maratha forces right through the heart of the enemy camp. The Maratha escape plan was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, and it required a lot of moving parts to be executed successfully. It demanded misdirection, blistering speed, and an intimate knowledge of the unforgiving Sahyadri mountains. And the Marathas had one end goal in mind: to escape the fort and reach the fortress of Vishalgarh, a highly defensible fort that was roughly 60 kilometers away. But this was easier said than done, because Vishalgarh itself was also besieged by allies of the Bijapur Sultanate. So for this plan to be a success, Shivaji and his forces would have to slip through one siege, outrun an army, and violently break through a second siege, and he would have to manage all of this with a force of less than 600 men. But the masterstroke of this plan was the element of deception that no one could have seen coming. as a local barber named Shiva Kashid bore an uncanny physical resemblance to Shivaji, and he volunteered to act as a decoy by allowing himself to be deliberately captured by enemy forces, hoping that the Bijapuri commanders would believe they had truly captured the Maratha king. And if the deception was somehow unveiled, the real Shivaji would at least have a crucial head start. Whatever the outcome may have been, everyone knew that Shiva Kashid was not going to be returning from the camp of Siddi Jauhar alive. But this would be just the first of many sacrifices that would be made to ensure Shivaji's escape on that rain-swept night of July 13, 1660. And as planned, Shivaji slipped out of Panhala Fort at midnight with a vanguard of 600 of his most elite soldiers, and initially it appeared as if the deception had worked and that the enemy forces had truly believed they had caught Shivaji. But when Bijapuri commander Siddi Jauhar further interrogated the decoy, he eventually realized he held a fake king as his prisoner, and his fury and wrath was absolute. Shiva Kashid was executed on the spot, and the relentless pursuit to capture the real Shivaji would begin. Siddi Masood, the son-in-law of the commander Siddi Jauhar, would be in charge of this mission, and he immediately mobilized a rapid pursuit column to track down and defeat the Maratha vanguard. And later chronicles would state that this Adilshahi force consisted of up to 10,000 men. But modern historians treat these specific numbers as symbolic exaggerations, and the true number of the Bijapur pursuit force remains unknown. But regardless, it was definitely in the thousands, and the Marathas were outnumbered by a staggering margin. The race for the fate of an empire was on. Shivaji's men navigated the brutal, forested tracks of the mountains, but their pace was hampered by the mud and the dark and the countless number of poisonous and wild animals that live in the jungles of India. All of this meant that Siddi Masood and his massive column of cavalry and infantry was gaining ground on the Marathas, and they were catching up to them very quickly. But the Marathas knew that nearby there was a narrow, steep-sided gorge known as Khind, the horses' pass, in which the advantage of superior numbers could be minimalized, as the Bijapuri force would have to pass through a narrow pass to attack the Marathas. And when the Marathas reached Khind, Shivaji decided to split their forces. Half would stay as a rear guard and hold the path for as long as possible, and Shivaji would take the remaining 300 and continue with their frantic dash towards the fortress of Vishalgarh. Whether they said it or not, everyone knew that the 300-man rear guard was not going to survive the encounter. They had only one sole purpose in mind: to make one of the greatest last stands in Indian history and hold the Bijapuri Sultanate's army at the gorge until the cannons of Vishalgarh fired, which would be the signal that Shivaji had reached safety and that their mission had been successful. And command of the suicidal rear guard was handed to Baji Prabhu Deshpande, a veteran Maratha general who was 15 years older than Shivaji and one of the most respected figures in the entire Maratha kingdom. Him, his 3 brothers and roughly 300 hand-picked men were ready to show the Bijapur forces the might of the Maratha army. And when Siddi Masood's vanguard hit the gorge, they quickly realized their cavalry was useless in such tight quarters, and they were forced into conducting claustrophobic infantry assaults. But small bands of Maratha soldiers locked down the mouth of the ravine, forcing the Adilshahi troops to attack only in small numbers, while the bulk of the army waited outside of the gorge. And for many hours the 300 Marathas fought with terrifying ferocity and bravery. Wave after wave of Adilshahi infantry crashed into the defenders, and the fighting was brutal, with primarily hand-to-hand melee combat taking place with swords, daggers and spears doing their best to stab enemy bodies in the low visibility of the night. And Baji Prabhu himself led from the front, sustaining catastrophic wounds, yet refusing to let the line break. Every Bijapuri soldier that fell clogged the pass further, costing Siddi Masood precious time and soldiers. But miles away from the epic last stand taking place at Khind, The second phase of this nightmarish escape plan had started. Shivaji arrived at Vishalgarh only to find enemy forces had heavily entrenched the fort from all sides. And without breaking stride, the exhausted Maratha king alongside his men launched a sudden and vicious assault on the besiegers. And this surprise attack by the desperate Maratha vanguard shattered the encirclement. Shivaji breached the gates, secured the fortress, and immediately gave the order. The roar of the cannons echoed across the Sahyadris mountains. Down in the blood-soaked mud of Gorkhind, Baji Prabhu Deshpande heard the blast of the cannons, and he knew his mission was at last complete. And according to Maratha tradition, only upon hearing the signal did the legendary commander finally allow himself to succumb to his wounds and pass away from this world. And by the time the sun finally rose that morning on July 13, 1660, the Battle of Pavan Khind was over, and in a strict military sense, it was a tactical defeat for the Marathas. The defenders were annihilated, killed or mortally wounded to a man, but not without inflicting massive casualties to the Adilshahi pursuers. But in the grand scheme of things, it was a monumental strategic triumph, as this last stand ensured that the Maratha Empire would continue to grow and get more powerful under the command of Shivaji. Baji Prabhu and his men's sacrifice bought the exact time and space required to save the nucleus of the Maratha state. If Shivaji had fallen at Panhala or been run down in the jungles, the rebellion would have fractured and the history of India would have been permanently altered. And the willingness of senior generals from the Maratha kingdom to die in order to ensure the safety of their king cemented Shivaji's absolute legitimacy and moral authority amongst his people, with him acting as a beacon of hope when the Deccan so desperately needed one. And in honor of the men who laid down their lives for him that night, Shivaji officially renamed Gorkhind to Pavankhind, the Holy Pass, and it remains a profoundly sacred geographic and commemorative landmark in Maharashtra even to this day, where the sacrifice of these 300 men is proudly remembered by all who pass through the narrow gorge of Pavan Khind today. So I hope you enjoyed this video on a little discussed battle in Indian history, and if you found it to be interesting and educational, then please do share this video with others, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe to my channel Lethal History so you can find out more about wars, weapons, and warriors from Indian history. Thank you so much for watching this video and have a great day. Bye.